In the 18th century, the land that makes up the modern United States did not exist as a sovereign nation. This map displays the actual political reality of the era. The eastern seaboard was entirely composed of British colonies, legally bound to an overseas empire. Look at the wide expanse of the Atlantic Ocean depicted here, separating these settlements from London. That geographic distance created a severe administrative lag. Living thousands of miles from the monarch, colonists developed their own distinct culture and localized priorities. They started demanding the ability to govern their own towns, establish their own local laws, and secure basic legal protections. An abstract concept began taking root in the colonial consciousness. They wanted freedom. The growing focus on individual rights and local rule made it harder to maintain a legal status that classified these people as mere subjects of a distant king. As colonial populations grew and demanded more autonomy, the British Empire responded by tightening its administrative grip. Parliament executed this control primarily through mandatory levies, forcing colonists to pay increasing taxes on everyday transactions. This sheet shows the physical evidence: British revenue stamps from 1765, pressed onto everyday colonial documents. Zooming tightly on these one-penny crests and official signatures reveals the formal bureaucracy of financial extraction designed to fund the military. But the colonists had zero representatives in the British Parliament. These financial mandates were dictated entirely without their input. Paying higher prices is an economic burden. Being forced to pay those prices by a government that refuses to hear your voice registers as a betrayal of the basic social contract. That systemic failure triggered an immediate psychological reaction. Deep frustration spread rapidly through the population. Localized grievances quickly linked up. Farmers in Massachusetts began coordinating with merchants in Pennsylvania and Virginia, forming a unified network of resistance. This compounding tension created a highly volatile political environment across the entire eastern seaboard. The louder the colonists demanded representation, the more rigidly the British government enforced its imperial authority with punitive laws and military occupation. Neither side possessed a mechanism or the willingness to de-escalate the conflict. By the mid-1770s, the accumulation of financial weight and the total lack of a political release valve made the relationship between the colonies and the crown unsustainable. In the summer of 1776, the system breaks completely. Colonial leaders take radical, irreversible action by drafting a document constituting high treason against the crown. This faded parchment is the physical record of that breaking point, the Declaration of Independence. Reading the bold text at the top reveals the core announcement. The 13 colonies are formally uniting and declaring absolute separation from Great Britain. With these words, they shed their legal identities as passive subjects. This radical move was driven by a specific priority: the demand that freedom be recognized as a legal right rather than a gift from a monarch. Forged by rising taxes and voicelessness, this singular written declaration crosses a line of no return, setting a rebellion into motion. In 1783, the American Revolution ended, and a new, independent nation officially began. But defeating an empire proved to be the easy part. Designing a functional government to replace it was a much heavier burden. This document, the Constitution, was drafted specifically to hold the fragile country together. It laid out a system of democracy, outlining exactly how power would be distributed and how the individual states would govern themselves. The entire political experiment and the survival of the Republic rested completely on the strength of that newly drafted paper architecture. In the decades that followed, the young United States began to grow at an explosive rate. Looking at this historical map, we see vast tracts of land, like the Louisiana Purchase and Mexican Cession, pushing the country's borders thousands of miles westward. As new territories incorporated into the Union, economic opportunity increased alongside the booming population. Yet, beneath the surface of this outward prosperity, a severe ideological division was taking root. The sheer speed of this physical expansion acted as a violent stress test, exposing deep structural cracks in the Republic's foundation that could no longer be ignored. One specific issue threatened to collapse the entire democratic system: the legal institution of slavery. Voices rose to challenge the existence of human bondage, spearheaded by fierce abolitionists like Frederick Douglass, who mounted a relentless moral and political campaign against it. This map illustrates the literal geographic fracturing of the country, drawing a harsh dividing line that split the states into two factions. Above that line, the North was rapidly building factories and railroads, while the South maintained an agrarian economy, driven entirely by enslaved labor. What began as bitter debates in Congress over whether new states would allow slavery quickly escalated into acts of localized violence. The architecture of the Constitution proved incapable of resolving its greatest internal contradiction, leaving open warfare as the only remaining outlet. The tension finally broke, and the American Civil War began. It was a highly mechanized slaughter, pitting countrymen against one another on a massive scale. Hundreds of thousands of young men marched into these battles, bearing the staggering physical cost required to decide the fate of the Republic. The conflict pushed the United States to the absolute edge of permanent collapse, testing the durability of its democratic institutions at every single level. This photograph of shattered buildings and discarded artillery along a riverbank captures the literal destruction of the American landscape left in the wake of the fighting. The war effectively deconstructed the original republic, tearing down its physical infrastructure right alongside its political norms. After 4 years of unrelenting bloodshed, the central government managed to survive. Looking closely at the handwritten Emancipation Proclamation, we see the legal mechanism that delivered the Union's critical victory: the absolute abolition of slavery. Enforcing this order finally stripped away the fatal flaw embedded in the nation's foundation since 1776. But victory came at a staggering cost, leaving the country deeply traumatized, physically broken, and scarred. The pre-war version of the United States had been shattered by its own internal contradictions. Now, the survivors faced the daunting task of picking up the pieces and reconstructing an entirely new social and political order from the ashes. This painful process required sweeping amendments to the Constitution, forcing the country to forge a more unified, centralized national identity. By purging its deepest moral failure and surviving a near-fatal stress test, the political framework gained a resilience it previously lacked. The true cost of building a lasting nation was a brutal war that required breaking the country in order to save it, creating a structure finally capable of surviving. After the war, the United States was vast, but deeply fragmented. Isolated pockets of population were separated by massive, empty gaps, leaving the country economically disconnected. Small-scale agricultural methods were sufficient for sustaining towns, but they lacked the capacity to pull a fragmented continent together. To survive, the country needed a massive upgrade. It required a physical and economic foundation built for heavy volume and national reach. Two major forces stepped in to fill that void. First, the aggressive expansion of the rail network. Second, the rise of the industrial factory. Iron, steam, and a relentless industrial machine provided the brute force required to physically unify the country and rebuild its foundation. Laying down this network was a grueling physical effort. Laborers pushed steel tracks through deserts and stretches of untamed land that were previously considered impassable. Railroads effectively shrunk the map. Coal and iron were pulled from remote outposts and shipped into central population hubs in a matter of days. Millions of tons of heavy material began moving at speeds and volumes that had never been possible before. This transit system provided the fuel for the next phase. Without it, the manufacturing boom would have stalled for lack of a steady supply. By acting as the country's circulatory system, the rail network pumped raw materials where they were needed most, creating the exact conditions for factories to scale. Enormous brick manufacturing complexes emerged at the intersections of these new rail lines, dominating the skyline with towering smokestacks. Inside these walls, production sped up. Mechanized machinery ran endlessly, allowing workers to produce goods faster than any manual craftsman. Slow-paced workshops were replaced by a model of high-volume, mass-market manufacturing. These machines required immense human energy to run. A demand for intense physical labor drew in millions of workers to keep the furnaces burning. Moving raw materials at rail speed into mechanized factories created a domino effect. The combined output forced the economy into a cycle of rapid growth. As jobs centralized around these factories, the demographics of the country shifted. Millions of people packed up and moved toward these concentrated hubs of opportunity. Quiet local outposts were overtaken by dense, chaotic urban centers. The streets became choked by heavy commerce, trolleys, and thousands of new residents moving shoulder to shoulder. These expanding populations created a massive new demand for goods, which drove production and trade rates even higher. The American city became a synchronized economic engine designed specifically to sustain constant industrial output. This nationwide trade network generated a surge in total wealth, resulting in fortunes that built sprawling stone estates and grand architectural monuments. The United States had evolved from a fractured landscape into a powerful, centralized economic entity. The national character shifted alongside the economy, anchoring itself in the grit of industry and a devotion to hard work. Soon, this economic momentum spilled over the country's borders, filling commercial harbors with steamships and barrels of goods waiting for export. The cause and effect chain of wood, steel, and steam produced the economic leverage that elevated the United States into a dominant global superpower. Before the 20th century, the nation operated almost entirely on the global periphery. It possessed a growing industrial base, but largely kept its focus inward, while established empires managed the world. The outbreak of 2 world wars fractured that entire system. These massive conflicts drained national treasuries, leveled industrial centers, and wiped away established borders. When the smoke finally cleared, the traditional European powers were financially exhausted. A massive void opened in the international hierarchy. The global map had essentially been wiped clean, and the planet required a completely new organizational structure to function. To meet the immediate threat, the United States executed a rapid, massive mobilization, deploying millions of citizens across multiple oceans. Equipping those soldiers required domestic factories to run continuously. This immense manufacturing demand acted as a high-powered stimulus, surging economic output to levels no one had previously modeled. By the end of the second conflict, the American mainland remained entirely intact. The nation stood with undamaged infrastructure and held the vast majority of the world's wealth. But arriving at the top tier of nations through massive wartime production does not guarantee you will stay there once the treaties are signed. With the immediate crisis resolved, the massive assembly lines slowed down. The state had to figure out how to maintain its forward momentum without the driving force of a global conflict. The strategy required looking past physical metrics like steel production and troop counts. The next phase of competition would be entirely intellectual. The government began channeling vast streams of capital directly into complex research systems, funding university laboratories and advanced engineering programs. This capital yielded concrete advancements, early logistical computing systems, rapid aerospace developments, and entirely new communication networks. The primary arena for international competition shifted away from capturing geographic territory and moved directly into the laboratories. Instead of specializing in a single export, the country built simultaneous leads in agriculture, finance, medicine, and engineering. Discoveries in the lab created entirely new industries, generating immense wealth used to fund advanced defense and research. This self-reinforcing loop, capital funds science, science builds defense protects capital, forms the structural architecture of a modern superpower. It is this specific combination of deep financial reserves and relentless technological progress that made the nation's global advantage permanent. Today, that framework spans the globe. American financial institutions, cultural exports, and defense alliances trace a grid across nearly every continent. To see the actual scale, this map illustrates the North American colonies at the Declaration of Independence. The project was tightly confined against the eastern seaboard. It requires a massive leap to imagine stretching from these isolated settlements into a unified transcontinental state. The survival of that early republic was never guaranteed. It navigated severe economic depressions and a brutal civil conflict long before it could project power across an ocean. A set of abstract constitutional theories written on parchment ultimately materialized into the institutional framework that governs modern international relations. What began as a desperate rebellion against a distant king evolved over 2.5 centuries into undisputed global leadership.